Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the meeting of the Overview and Scrutiny panel under our new name of Environment, Communities and Partnerships. We'd also like to welcome the other Scrutiny panel of Performance and Growth and the members that have attended this evening, and welcome. Really glad that you can join us. It's really exciting that you can be here and ask the questions of the officers and Laura here. So let's move on with the agenda. Have we got any apologies? I think we're all here, aren't we?
No apologies.
No apologies this evening. So let's move on to the minutes, pages 5 to 8. We're to approve as a correct record of the minutes of the Overview and Scrutiny panel, Customers and Partnership meeting held on the 1st of December 2022. Has anyone got any comments? Is everyone in agreement with the minutes? Thank you. So members' interest, which receive from members declarations as to disclosable pecuniary and other interests in relation to any agenda item. Does anyone have any interest? Councillor Alban.
Visions of the full council meeting. There we go. It may be a bit tenuous, but it's probably best to declare it. My son works for a company that sells electric scooters, not the mobility scooters, but the scooter-long ones, which are electric vehicles in its broader sense. And so although I have no financial interest, if that comes up, it's probably best to declare it ahead of time.
Thank you. Then we'll move on to the agenda item 3, the notice of key executive decisions, pages 9 to 18. Has everyone read and noted the key executive decisions attached onto the agenda item? Has anyone got any comments on the item? No? Wonderful. We can then move on to item 4, which is the climate strategy. Before we start, are we having a presentation?
No, I don't think. Not a PowerPoint. No, I think just an introduction.
Just an introduction. So Laura, introducing Laura, and the officers here who have written, I presume everyone's read the reports. They're amazing. I just want to thank the officers here now for the amazing report that they've written. Neil and the team, thank you so much. So has anyone got any comments over the climate strategy?
I think perhaps they might want to present something first.
Okay.
Yeah. It should come on.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'm really gladdened to see how many of you have turned out tonight, especially those of you who have come to Scrutiny 2 nights in a row, which I know is quite a commitment. And also thanks for all of you that participated earlier in the year when we had member engagement sessions on the climate strategy. It was really important to get your feedback at that early point of the strategy formation process. That was really helpful. My plan was just to walk through a few of the highlights of the strategy with you, with a few extra points that might not be obvious from reading it. And I'll start off with the recommendations that the report contains for Cabinet. So there's 3 recommendations. The first is the declaration of a climate crisis and an ecological emergency. The second is the adoption of a climate strategy in direct response to those emergencies being declared. And the third is that with this strategy, it would be under annual review. So to come back to Scrutiny and to the Cabinet every year, following a conversation with external sources who would also provide us with some scrutiny, and then to provide you with an idea of how far we've come and where we still need to go. But overall, the strategy outlines 2 aims for our council. The first is to reduce our own council emissions to net zero by 2040. The second is to use our position of leadership to encourage our residents and businesses to take their own climate action. And so the first goal is one that we have a lot of control over, but the second goal is even more powerful, where we have the ability to influence the people around us in Huntingdonshire and make a larger impact on carbon emissions. And I would remind you back to the motion that we all discussed at Council a few months ago. We're not just facing a climate crisis, but a cost of living crisis as well. So not only is our goal to cut carbon, but also to provide some resilience for our council and our residents in terms of the fluctuating prices of energy supply in the current environment. So throughout the document, you will see 3 ways that we believe the council should be taking action. The first is by being an example ourselves, taking action within the council, improving processes within our own organization. The second is enabling climate action by others. And the third is using our influence to try to encourage others to take climate action. And so if you open the climate strategy to the big circle, you'll see around it there are 6 objectives. And while you're reading, you might have wondered, well, why these 6? Why is this the important elements that we need to focus upon? And the answer to that is because it's what our residents have asked us to focus on. In February of 2021, we undertook a resident survey asking them things like, what would be your #1 priority for Huntingdonshire District Council to tackle? And those answers, and also a survey that was taken of town and parish councillors, led to us forming these 6 high-level categories that we think are the most priority for us to focus on. I would also draw your attention in this strategy to probably the most important page, the trajectory. And I'd like to describe a little bit of it, help you interpret that trajectory. So first of all, we have a red dotted line. So that's a linear path to go from the carbon emissions of the council in 2019 to net zero in 2040. The green line is based on technology available now and the path that we think that we can follow now, how we will get to net zero. The slope of the dotted red line is linear. And so if we think about 0 being our goal for 2040, that means we can also calculate intermediate goals. For example, along that line, by 2025, the dotted red line will be at 2,622 tons of CO2 equivalent. So although we have a long-term goal, we have a trajectory against which we can measure our progress all along that route. The next part of this strategy I'd like to highlight for you is our hierarchy of action, this nice rainbow graphic on page 9. And this hierarchy is really the backbone of the strategy, because it talks about when encountering a climate challenge, how it should be approached. So starting from the top, our first aim should always be to avoid activities that create carbon. Then we should consider how to reduce our carbon emissions. And finally, looking at substitutes. Only after we've exhausted all of those options, we consider anything below the top 3 levels, as in sequestering carbon or offsetting carbon. So the strategy comes from the point of view of, we understand that offsetting carbon is an option, but for us, it's the last choice option, and we will explore everything else first. And I'd like to give you an example of how that might be applied in council. We have a fleet of bin lorries that create emissions. And one of the largest emission sources for our council is around transport and emissions from vehicles. So if we look at this hierarchy of decision-making, Whereas it might be tempting to think the best thing that we could do is replace all of our bin lorries with electric bin lorries. In fact, our hierarchy tells us that our first priority should be to avoid using bin lorries. Well, what does that mean? That means that if we can help encourage our residents to create less waste, then we have fewer bin lorries that we need to drive, fewer bin lorries we need to replace, fewer miles on the road, and fewer emissions. So we need to be smart about our decision-making and which technologies we choose to use and when. One of the greatest pitfalls that we must avoid is funding a well-intentioned change that in the end creates something that is more expensive to run and has created a larger carbon footprint, as in replacing a fleet which already has embedded carbon with an entirely new fleet with embedded carbon. Then I would like to draw your attention to the action plan. So that's Appendix 5. It looks like this. And one of the most important points of all three of the recommendations that we will put to Cabinet are that if there is a climate emergency, we immediately need to know what we're going to do about it, if we believe it to be an emergency. We've seen councils around the country declare a climate emergency and do nothing, declare a climate emergency, design an action plan, and not complete it. And what our challenge is, and I think what we need to hold ourselves accountable for, is declaring a climate emergency, designing an action plan, reviewing it every year, and making sure that we're staying on track and that the work is embedded. So the action plan in front of you, each action in this list, there's 2 pages, is an action that is included in the work program of a department of the council. So they don't stand alone. There are managers, and in fact, there are cabinet members who are responsible for each one. And this is important, that the work is not isolated into one department called the Environment Department or the Climate Department. These are changes that need to happen throughout the organization. So when this plan does come to Cabinet, I intend to add a column at the end about which cabinet members are associated with it, each one, just to give you a bit more clarity about how that is spread through the organization. One thing that I have received some questions about in the action plan have to do with 2 actions around waste, both of which mention 60%. And I just would like to highlight that those are 2 different actions and targets that we have. One is around our recycling rate, and the second is around overall how much waste are our residents creating and that we need to collect. So if you look at the action plan, there are 3 actions at the top. Those are our 3 highest priority actions. Developing a plan for 100% renewable energy usage, reviewing assets for energy efficiency, and reviewing our fleet. So how did we determine what would be high and what would be medium and what would be low? Well, there are a few factors. The first is how much would greenhouse gases emissions be reduced compared to the council's baseline? The second was how much carbon reduction would that create in Huntingtonshire? How would it affect the resilience of our council and our communities in changing weather? How much the action might cost? And how much control our council has over that particular area of work? So in reviewing all of those different elements, we developed a matrix to decide what was the highest priority, what was medium, and what was low. But the important element of the action plan is that it should be brought back to you each year with a reassessment of, are these still the highest, medium, and low? How will we performed against them? One area I'm sure that you're interested to hear more about is finance. And I'm sure you have questions about finance. So I'll speak to it a bit now, but you can ask questions again later. So all of the actions in the Climate Action Plan are included in the appropriate service areas, not just their work plan, but their annual budget as well. So there's a purpose to this strategy coming to you before the annual budget setting process. So the things I'm proposing will have to be sustainable enough to fit within the budget that you will have to review in the next political cycle. There are two other elements that will have financial implications of the strategy. One is the inclusion of a climate officer role, a one full-time equivalent person. And this person would be a coordinator to help us keep track of how we're doing and help us return to you once a year and report back. And to lead some of the other employees in the council in their climate work. It's possible we may hire a part-time person to enable us to have occasional expertise and have some funding available in those instances where we only need one-off advice. If service managers decide they'd like to undertake a larger project, then they will have to make a business case for it, just like they would with other types of work in their area. And that assessment of that business case would include details of any external funding sources that they may be able to find to help them with that work. The other financial implication in this strategy outlines a £100,000 climate accelerator reserve. And I'll explain why I like to call it the accelerator. This reserve would be earmarked to unlock external funding. I'll give you an example. If we would like to add solar panels to some of our ancillary buildings owned by the council, let's say the Huntingdon Bus Shelter, if officers want to apply for funding from external sources to do that, they have to have a survey. They have to know how much it's going to cost and how much they want to ask for. And so this reserve would be the place where they would go to have funds in order to prepare their bid. Because often the funding sources that pop up are at very short notice. And if they can have the project in mind, ready to go, they are able to make the bid, and it gives them much more flexibility and proactivity to be able to grab those funding sources as they appear. Also, I think it's important that we are flexible enough to be able to grab new technologies as they appear. I think that over the lifetime of this strategy, technology will change greatly. And our green trajectory each year when we look at it may well be able to go down a lot faster if a new technology becomes available that we think is financially the right decision to make. So who will be able to dip into this reserve, this accelerator reserve? Well, officers would have to make a proposal, as they would in order to access any reserve, to the ideas process that is normally used in the council. And then the senior leadership team, chaired by the Section 151 officer, would decide whether that is the right financial use of that reserve in order to access external funding. And if you think about the quantum of the reserve, so £100,000, I think this amount is reasonable given the proportional level of urgency of the crisis before us, but also the priority that we need to be giving to these activities. If we consider that today, if we wanted to buy an electric bin lorry, it would cost over £300,000 just for one. I think £100,000 in a reserve to help us access funding and be able to move quickly when the external funding appears is completely reasonable. So the strategy comes to you in advance of our annual budget setting process, and so all the financial implications that I've mentioned are subject to the next political cycle when the medium-term financial plan will be brought before you. And so the strategy outlines spending and a reserve that are proposed in that budget process, which will come to you soon. So spending on climate action is not separate from other financial business of this council, and that's very important in order to make it sustainable and long-lasting. So I believe that the financial implications of this strategy are both proportionate to the financial challenges and the climate challenges that our council are facing. So when can you expect to hear back about this strategy again if it is passed by Cabinet? Well, I expect you to hear about it again every year. In an annual report to both Scrutiny and Cabinet, I anticipate you being able to see that where our carbon assessment sits on that trajectory versus our baseline, what the progress is on each of the climate actions in the action plan, an assessment of whether those climate actions are still the most appropriate, and that green trajectory of how we get to zero, what we think about that, and the technology that we knew about a year ago, is it still appropriate or does it require a reassessment? The last thing that it will include when it comes to you, to give you an update, will be a summary of feedback from external stakeholders. Because once a year, not only do I think that we will reassess the strategy and progress, but we also want to ask external people, our residents, our environmental groups, experts, about what they think. How are we doing? What could we be doing differently? And that will form input into our plans for the next year. So some of the dates in the action plan may seem far off to you. We have some priority actions that we would expect to be completed by this time next year or by this time in 2 years. But that doesn't mean that work hasn't already begun. Those are certainly the deadlines by which we hope to see them be completed, but we would certainly hope they'd be done more quickly, and I would encourage officers in that way, with not too much pressure. But let me tell you about a few things that are already underway on this action plan. So in terms of our fleet of vehicles, we've commissioned the Energy Savings Trust to assess our fleet's transition away from traditional fuels. And they're doing some survey work, but also we're looking for their expertise on how much can the grid handle? How much would we be able to charge? How many vehicles would we be able to charge now if we were to invest on the infrastructure for charging? At Ramsey Leisure Center, decarbonization work moved at pace. And I hope to bring you a report on this separately in the near future, because I think it's important to look at it as a project as a whole. We can think about the emissions from that leisure center in the past and what has been achieved now, and that can help us inform our future decisions. Biodiversity work is accelerating with funding from the Combined Authority, and we also have an EV charging survey underway. And in the near future, that will hopefully lead to some task and finish work on determining what is our role in EV charging in our region. And I'm hoping that the climate working group will play a part in that. There's one more element, a final element of a climate strategy, and that's called the climate conversation. And I was hoping that one of our officers who spent over a year working on this strategy might tell us more about that, and that's Helen Lack.
Hello.
Yep.
Hi. Yeah, thanks for that, Lara. So yeah, I've been working on this for over a year now, and what I'd really like to say is thank you to everyone for your input and support to get to this point, actually. What I'm really excited about is once we get through this strategy and we get to that point where we can actually review on an annual basis, I want to be able to really believe in the example, setting example by, so actually sharing what we've been doing as a district council. So some of the major pieces of work, so like the local plan revision, the Biodiversity for All programme, and actually any work we're doing something around sustainable travel. So we can actually start talking to our stakeholders about what we're doing as a district council and how far we've come. Then I want to be able to actually use that event to let others talk to us, tell us what they think, show us what they're doing, let our towns and parish councils share information amongst themselves, share good practice. I just think it would be a really good opportunity for us to actually collate a picture of where we are on an annual basis and then bring it back to you alongside the statistical information that backs up our action plan and where we are, and whether we need to make any revisions to the action plan on an annual basis. Okay, thank you.
Neil Sloper has also been working for over a year on this strategy, and I know he has a few more comments he'd like to make.
I just wanted to emphasise to members that this is an evidence-based strategy, and that evidence has been informed by working with a group called Local Partnerships, who you may or may not be aware of. Local Partnerships is a jointly owned enterprise, HM Treasury, the Local Government Association and the Welsh Government, and they actually created the calculator that we've used for local authorities to create their carbon footprint. So I wanted to just emphasise that this is authentic. We have used external support to calculate it properly, and that they are engaged to support us as we start off in the first few years as well, to make sure that it is right and proper and that we can embed that in what the council does, because that was very important. That's very much been the bit for us as a business, because we can look at our own emissions, but the reflection is that our emissions are part of the local authority landscape in Huntingdonshire. Collectively, that's 2% of the carbon footprint for Huntingdonshire as a whole. So yes, it's a small slice, but we can show by setting good intention. The other bit is harder, which is why the climate conversation that Helen has just gone through, and also the consultation approach that we've taken in developing this strategy, is so important. We know, for example, that our residents are really, really, really committed to the environment, the green environment, and the role that that has to play. But we have to recognise that whilst that's really important, it isn't necessarily the thing that's going to make the biggest change to the carbon emissions in the district. So we do have Biodiversity for All as a programme of activity. We are looking at increasing our biodiversity on our assets and changing how we manage our green assets. But at the same time, we need to encourage and work with community groups and parishes to pilot ideas and look at different ways of changing behaviour. And that is the biggest challenge that we face. We've got some really good levers. The review of the local plan is a very significant lever, and obviously government policy is changing as well. So, but we will pick that up in, that's why the climate conversation is so important. So it's just to emphasise really that evidence base and that prioritisation is sound as we present this to members for consideration. Thank you.
Thank you so much, officers and Laura, for your presentation. And also we'd like to thank the local partnership for their involvement. Clearly, they've given you a lot of tools to evidence everything. So let's open up for questions. Councillor Shaw?
Hello. Thank you. First, I'd just like to say, what a brilliant report. Certainly kept me entertained over the last week or so. So thank you for that. I think you sort of answered this question, Lara. The climate coordinator salary that's mentioned in the action plan, is that coming from the 100,000 reserve, or is that coming from elsewhere?
That's not included in reserve, no.
My only other comment or request, as it may be, is related to nationally significant infrastructure projects, your A14, your Black Cat roundabout. Personally, I'd like to see a policy of when, of trying to basically leaving the district in a better state than it was before these projects are started. I know the highways tend to try and, I think my wording, sorry, basically get a net gain, so make the district better, so more trees planted, and increase, stop flood risk quite so much. They tend to say you get 5 million litres of water falling, and they try and make it break even, but I'd like to see it sort of improved, if that makes sense. Sorry for my poor explanation.
I think this is a really good example of how we have a dual role here. We have our ability to make specific changes within our own sphere of influence, but we also shouldn't neglect our opportunities to influence others. And that's why one of the elements of the climate strategy that's so important is the local plan. The local plan won't necessarily affect national strategic infrastructure projects, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be using our voice when those projects are coming into their region. And so I look forward to working with my colleague in the cabinet holder for planning if opportunities like that should come up. Yeah.
Thank you. Councillor Gledo.
Thank you. I just wanted to thank you for the report. It's very good, and I fully support the whole issue of climate change. Now, I can't emphasise how important it is generally. Going back to the point that Councillor West made about the coordinator, it strikes me that this is quite a senior position. It's going to be in the council, fairly influential. Should that actually just be a coordinator and part-time rather than more of a full-time post? And would they be responsible for the £100,000 budget?
Thank you for your question. I think the first thing to say is that responsible for the £100,000 budget, no, because that will be decided through SLT as it's a reserve. So it will be, there'll be monitoring of the use of the reserve, and this officer would be the person preparing the report on how it is used, but the decision making would be embedded within the strategic level of the council. In terms of team and in terms of responsibility for climate coordinator is part of the responsibilities. So Helen, to my left, is the lead officer for the environment. So as well as parks and open spaces, the environment is coming into her portfolio. And as Helen's line manager and as the member on SLT, I'm responsible for that as well. So therefore, the climate coordinator is a vital part of the machinery to make it all happen and coordinate and follow up with managers across all services to make sure that the actions are followed up, their support, and also to give advice or even investigate different opportunities where managers don't always have the time to do that themselves. So, for example, at the moment, we're already working with our facilities team to look at how we can do a specification to look at PV on our buildings, because the team who are busy doing the facilities work don't have the full capacity to do that specification. So they're part of the work, but the climate coordinator is critical in pulling it together. The same with budget bids. We often need input from lots of different people, and so having a coordinator is vital to make sure that we get the right bits in the right order at the right time. So I hope that explains sort of the purpose of the role and where they fit into things.
Thank you. Just, is this going to be a permanent position or a fixed-term contract?
It's a budget bid for a permanent role, but we already have funding for the transition into the delivery of the strategy, because that was foreseen at the start of the strategy journey. So
I would add just one more point to that. I think it's very important that we don't create a senior officer role in charge of climate, because all of the officers are responsible for climate, all of the cabinet members are responsible for climate, and that responsibility has to be felt across the board. Otherwise, the changes we're trying to make won't be sustainable or long-term.
Thank you. Councillor Wells.
Thank you, Chair. In the document, there are various references to renewable energy generation, which is obviously very desirable as a component of the climate action plan, wherever we can actually achieve more renewable energy generation. That's obviously got to be a great thing as a contributor to the plan. So in the document, we talk about the carbon trajectory, and it talks about a fully renewable energy tariff by 2023. And other parts of the strategy and action plan mention developing a plan towards a fully renewable energy scenario. So what is the plan and what is the timeline for this, please?
I think this is a really good example of how the environment of all of this work is changing very quickly. So in October, we had the opportunity to join a tariff that was not 100% renewable energy was 50% renewable energy. And in the current climate, not just the climate of climate change, but of the cost of living crisis, that was the right thing to do in that moment. But what that did highlight is that we need to have an energy strategy. We need to know when that decision comes up again, how we're going to make that decision, how the different elements are going to be weighted so that we make the best possible decision. So I think that the wording that's included in the action plan is more accurate to where I would like it to be, that our goal should be to develop an energy policy. But in terms of what is the timeline, I think when should we be purchasing 100% renewable energy? Certainly by 2040. I hope by as soon as possible. And I think officers will take every opportunity along the way to try to achieve that, although there are many pitfalls. If you look at the way that renewable energy tariffs are advertised, there's a lot of greenwashing involved, and we'll have to be very careful that we don't just move the non-renewable energy to other purchasers other than ourselves. And we should exploit any opportunities to create our own renewable energy, and in fact, to reduce the amount of energy that we need overall and that we have to be concerned in obtaining for the council.
Thank you, Councillor Cooley.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Lara. A great report, and I've told you already, I think this is a great step forward, so well done, and I'm very excited by it. I've got a few questions, if I may, Chair. The first one, and you know I like your table here of your priorities. Offsetting, and we all understand the risks of offsetting. Can we just be clear, if we're going for net zero by 2040, that means there will be no consideration of any offsetting before we get to 2040, when we effectively have to look at what we haven't been able to get rid of, thus net zero. So that's my first question. I think take them as they come, I think might be better, yeah.
I think as we approach 2040, that would be the time to start considering what our options will be. I hope we won't have to, but I can be realistic about that. In that hierarchy that I know you like, the yellow, the orange, and the red levels are the things we're going to focus on. But the pink and the purple, yes, those are last chance options for us to consider as we get close to 2040. And that's sort of the definition of net zero, isn't it? So you attempt to reduce how much carbon you produce, and then in the end, if you can't reduce it any further, you dip into the levels below substitute. And so net, you will have created zero carbon, and that is what we're aiming for in 2040.
Thank you, Chair. And if you indulge me, Chair, there's just on the money, being a Conservative, I'm going to ask about the money, of course I am, but the 100,000 fund is, to some people it's a lot of money. It's not a lot when you consider what you're going to have to achieve here. When will we be topping this fund up? Is this something that we'll have to look at annually to top up, or any thoughts of how long that will, because that won't get us to 2040 and all the work that you're going to have to do. So that's the first money one. On the budgeting, and I was so glad to hear that executive councillors as well as officers will be taking responsibility. This will be built into budgeting, absolutely the right thing to do. Given all the headwinds that we know we're facing, what happens if there's just not going to be enough money in terms of achieving this, and this falls to the bottom? Have we thought about what that plan B might have to be?
So your first question was around the 100,000. Yeah. I'm going to let Neil answer the first question, then I'll answer the second question.
Okay, so it's a reserve. So we'll draw down on the reserve. And if that isn't all used, we can opt to carry forward that reserve if there's still a justifiable reason for carrying that reserve, in common with any reserves that the council has. I think in line with the annual review on the action plan, if there's a demand for the reserve to be reviewed, then there is an annual opportunity to propose that as part of the medium-term financial plan. At the moment, this is the starting blocks. I would also emphasise that this is not the money to make the change happen. It's the service budget money that needs to make this happen. So the way in which we spend our money on energy now needs to change. We need to have a pathway for that to change. And the opportunities to spend that money differently will change dramatically between now and 2040. Only yesterday, I was seeing that renewables have shot up to 21.6% compared to what they were before, which is fantastic news because, as we spoke earlier, it's about energy for everyone, not just the council. So it's not just our purchasing decision, it's Huntingdonshire's and nationally. So I think this is a starting point. We have an annual review, but there will need to be a business case for things like investment in significant electric vehicles or infrastructure. Only today we were discussing EV charging on one of our sites, and the exponential difference to move to rapid charging is still, add 2 zeros. And that makes the business case very hard right now. But a year ago, 2 years ago, we'd be having yet more zeros on that, even if the device was available. So it is that annual review and it is a reserve. And if we need to propose that, we will change that reserve. But it's an enabler, and we want to take advantage of any funding that comes to us, whether it's refit money that's been used for Ramsey Leisure Centre to help engineer that change, whether there's opportunities for different transport mechanisms from the combined authority. We will look for that initial seed funding from the reserve to make the change happen and draw in more money, because that money will be there, and we're seeing that happen in front of our eyes. So hopefully that explains how that will work.
Back. I totally get that, and I recognise the 100 grand is not for making it happen. I'm just concerned there's maybe not going to be as much as we hope, given the cost of consultants and externals and all the rest of it. And it's glad to hear that there's an annual process, perhaps, of just reviewing that and saying, do we still have enough? I'd hate for us to get halfway through this plan and we run out of money that enables that. So I totally understand. Thank you.
Can I answer the second question? First of all, I'm very happy to hear that my shadow cabinet member would like to spend lots more money on climate. I'll quote you on that. But I think that the root of your question was, how are we going to assess ourselves and know that we're still making the right decision along the way? And that's really where, so this red linear route, each year we need to determine, are we still below it? And are we as far below it as we think that we've spent the right amount of money? So it's not, is it the right time to make the decision? It's, is it the right technology for this decision? And is it at the right price as well? So each year we have that opportunity to reassess those questions, as Neil was saying. And that's one of the differences between this policy area compared to others, is that we're presenting it in a way that has to be flexible. And that's not just because of technology, that's because of the financial implications that I think you're alluding to.
Thank you. Councillor Hunt.
Thank you very much for bringing this evening, and I'm going to be quite blunt. I'm really excited about this, and I'm really excited about what we're going to be able to do going forward. I'm especially excited about the fact that there is a true kind of sense of wanting to keep ourselves to account on this with the trajectory, the annual reports and the climate conversation. So really glad about that. Just one question on statistics quickly. The report says that in one point where 78% of residents said the council's changed the rules so new developments should meet sustainability standards, and 73% of residents said the council should develop renewable energy. Can you just confirm where those statistics came from, please?
Can you remind me which page? Is this 11?
Yes.
I assume it would be energy. That's why you'd be so excited about it.
No, I'm not on energy form today. Yeah.
Okay. So in February of 2021, we surveyed residents of Huntingdonshire and businesses. And we asked them these questions. In some cases, we asked a multiple choice question where they could choose lots of things that they thought were a priority. In other cases, we asked them, what's the single most priority that you think we ought to be focusing on? That's where these statistics have come from. And so I would give you another example on, let's see, on page 10. So this is the buildings theme. We've used the statistics of 78% of residents said that the council should use planning rules to develop for new developments to meet sustainability standards. So this was a multiple choice question. 78% of residents chose that as something they thought was important. Another 83% chose restoring nature as something they thought was important. That's why one of the other elements of the strategy is about biodiversity. 73% said that they thought that renewable energy was important. And so that's why that's one of the other 6 and one of our priority focuses for the next year. So it's really responding to the feedback we've given from residents, from businesses, but also from town and parish councillors as well.
Very much.
Thank you. Councillor McAdam.
Is that on? Oh, right. Yeah. First of all, I'd just like to say what an excellent report this is. And thank you to all those involved for the hard work you've obviously put into it. It's nice and easy to understand, it's clear, it's logical, it's concise. As a council which is keen to show leadership, which is what we are doing, and I thank you for that leadership, it's very important that we carry others with us, you know, stakeholders, the public, and other councils, around the area, the town and parish councils, which we have a lot. How do we intend to move forward in engaging with all the different stakeholders, so that, you know, because in the end, it's not just us, as you said at the beginning. We really need everybody, as far as possible, to take part in this. Thank you.
I've been very pleasantly surprised since I began here in May how many towns and parishes and community groups have approached me about ideas they have, things they'd like to do, actions they want to take. And I think one of the most powerful things that we can do as a district council is convening them together. And when they hear the success stories of each other, they realize they can take climate action, and they also have a peer that they can go to ask how that organization got there. So those conversations are something that we would include in the annual climate conversation. So inviting those representatives from town and parish councils to listen to each other and tell their success stories to each other, and then take that back to their communities. I think there's also an element around the comms that we can plan around the success stories. So using our own comms channels to describe the journey that we're making, but also highlight some journeys of what local residents and businesses are going through as well. I think Neil has another point to make on that.
I'm delighted to confirm that almost 40 parish councils contributed to these priorities in developing the strategy, working with Capalc, and I have to give Penny recognition for her involvement in that. We've also been working with Penny on looking at options for working with some parishes as a pilot to help communities make decisions that would benefit the environment. We've actually been working with Anglia Ruskin University students on developing a way of doing that. And we've actually, because the students are so engaged, we've run 2 sessions with students that we've referred to in the report. They're actually lining up 3 groups of students to work with some parish councils moving forward. And that's one of the actions in our action plan. So we are taking it very seriously about engaging with the community, but also taking full account that actually there are people that are even closer to those communities where they are better able and better informed to look at the practicalities of what will make a difference. So really it was just to emphasise that point that we've started off working with them. They've helped co-create this. The carbon literacy training that was offered to councillors was actually from Capalc, and we were able to negotiate that and offer it to all of the district councillors to take that up. And as a result of that conversation, we were then able to get training for our own managers at the council as well. And we've got some more running actually on the 12th for our managers. So I suppose I just wanted to add that flavour of involvement from the off rather than an afterthought tapped on with a bit of consultation.
Councillor Alban.
Thank you, Chair. The environment has been a long and is a long time passion of mine, so I'm really pleased to see this report, to go through it. I'm really keen to be working with you and the other members of the Climate Working Group, because I think we've got a good role as a critical friend, but also to come up with ideas that might not be thought of. So I'm really pleased that that's up and running. You'll probably be pleased to know that the 2.5 pages of A4 notes worth of questions that I had, some of those have already been answered. But I have still got some questions. If I ask a couple, and then maybe can have another go later on, rather than take up too much time in one go. On point 3.3 and 4.2, and it goes back to the points Councillor Hunt made about the meat behind the statistics, and it refers to percentages of residents thought. So what I'm keen to know, before we make our recommendations to Cabinet, what was the level of engagement from the residents of Huntingdonshire? Because there's no context to that. So is it, my thoughts are, it's the percentage of residents that responded would be a more accurate statement. The other thing is, in terms of businesses and students, they might not be residents. I know when Mr. Sloper and I and Ms. Lack were at Hinchinbrook Country Park for the presentation on the proposals for Hinchinbrook Country Park, friends were there doing park run and who were from out of the district and had very valid points, but they weren't residents. So I'm just concerned that when we're making recommendations, we've got a fuller picture behind the statistics. So that's my first question, please.
Yeah, I take that on board. Perhaps it would be better for us to be quoting the percentage of respondents. Yeah, I can take that. In terms of the take-up of how many people participated, about 200 young people, just short of 500 responded to the survey last February, just short of 40 parish and town councils sent a representative or replied. And I think that those are, if you talk to pollsters who run polls, that's a reasonable response. I'd like it to be higher. And I think that as we continue down this journey, we need to get it higher. And I'm going to need all of your help to do that, because you're the ones that have the links into your community and can encourage your residents to be responding. So that's something we're going to have to do together, is try to increase those numbers. But I'm happy with the numbers that were achieved.
Thank you, Chair. Through you, that's useful to get the context behind that. I think having done surveys in the past, respondents can be fairly low, but there's still a picture there. I think if someone's taken the time to respond, that in itself is probably worth an additional weighting to it, but it's just to get the fuller picture before we make a recommendation. Excuse my voice. That covers 4.2. On 4.3, what work has been done or is envisaged to be done to minimise the carbon footprint involved in moving to decarbonising the council's existing fleet? I'm thinking of disposal of the existing fleet, the carbon footprint involved in that, in the disposal of any machinery. That in itself creates a carbon footprint. How much consideration has been taken into that, please?
So that is quite a significant concern of mine. One of the pitfalls we could fall into is disposing of diesel fleet means it's just moved elsewhere in the world, in fact, and it's continued to be used, but somewhere else in the world. So if you look at the three highest priority actions in our action plan, one of them is that review of fleet. And that's the opportunity we need to take to make a plan for when we do get to the point where we need to replace a vehicle. Which vehicle do we choose, and how do we deal with that waste that we're creating? I think it's an excellent question. It's one I don't have the answer to yet, but I think it's important that is one of the highest actions that we're thinking about. Is not just how do we replace the fleet, but what do we do with that waste that we create by, we're creating a vehicle with embedded carbon in it that we're deciding we no longer need anymore. No, so it's an excellent point. And I think Neil has something else to mention about that.
Unfortunately, from a previous life, I know a bit about fleet. So the first thing to emphasise is that we actually use decommissioned vehicles that have got to their, mainly their end of life because their chassis or their frame has got to the point where it's starting to be unreliable. Those parts are actually taken off the vehicles by our workshop, and we actually reuse those parts ourselves to keep our own fleet going. So the first thing is we do take our own medicine. We recycle our own bits from our own vehicles. The other things that we do is that we support other councils in doing that as well. So we work with Fenland and South Cams who've got the same vehicles, and we offer the same process for them for spare parts because they have the same demands and needs for some of the bits that fail from those vehicles. The other thing that we do as well is that none of our vehicles go to scrap. So our vehicles, if they're viable, they are actually recycled and they're resold to the market. So some of the requirements that we have in this country for vehicles is different to other countries. And so there is a market for those used vehicles which are no longer suitable for our requirements, but can be used elsewhere. So as a last resort, those vehicles aren't just disposed of. So if we can't reuse the parts ourselves, they will actually go on to another life somewhere else. So they're not actually just disposed of in the ground. And that's active management practice that's been in place now for, I'd say, 4 years, 5 years with the workshop where they've been doing that practice. I think that's fair to say. So Andy and the fleet management team at Waste, they do all of that proactively.
There's one more element to that, and I think our fleet manager and the skills that he has developed in that department are so strong that it's actually a double-edged sword, because it makes our decision about when to move to electric vehicles quite difficult, because they're very good at maintaining their vehicles, of which we already own the embedded carbon. And so we have to make quite a difficult decision at each renewal of a vehicle of, is it the right time to move to EV or not? So those skills are really important, and they'll make our decisions quite difficult in the years to come.
Thank you. I've got a quick question which was tied in with that one, if you don't mind answering it. From the carbon pathway scenarios diagram, I noted that the EV replacements for the small and medium vehicles would only begin in 2030. So I wondered if it's tied up with the answer to the last question and why it was so late, why it's so late.
There are a couple of reasons. One is, right now we have the opportunity to observe our peer councils and their move into large electric vehicles, places like South Cams and Cambridge City, and allow them to learn lessons that we can learn from as well. And I think we should take that opportunity. Also, the ability of our fleet manager to maintain a lot of the fleet that we already have beyond much of the lifetimes that were expected. But also, as I mentioned at the very start, the first thing we need to consider is how many vehicles do we need? Can we reduce how much waste our residents are creating? Perhaps rather than moving to an electric vehicle, the solution is to remove a vehicle from the fleet and have fewer bin lorries. So all of that decision making is going to take a little while as the technology develops at the same time.
Thank you. Just a quick question. You've identified 3 priorities. The first one is decarbonise, the second is reduce energy, and the third one is procure wisely. I think the first 2 are fairly obvious. Can you just give me a little bit more explanation of what actually procure wisely looks like? Thank you.
Yeah, so there in the list of the action plan, there is a medium level action which has to do with our procurement policy. And so at the moment when we're procuring things, we think about how much it costs and perhaps even what the social benefit is. Can we use a local provider? And what we need to determine is a third weighting, which is the environmental impact of what we procure. So the first step is we need to develop a framework that officers can use when they're procuring to rationalize what they're procuring and how much weighting to put to each of those elements. I don't know yet what those weightings should be, but that's the first action, is to determine that and for our procurement manager to develop that plan. So deciding wisely is, as I mentioned before, is it the right time to buy it? Is it the right thing to buy? Does it have social benefit as well as financial benefit and environmental benefit? And do those things weigh up in a rational way?
What's your time frame for that?
Let me check the action plan. Do you know the answer to that one? I'll let Neil answer that one.
It's one of our key priorities, which we're already talking about with the procurement officer. The question is whether we need extra resource to support them to do the piece of work, because our procurement officer has been exceptionally busy with lots of things that we're doing. We've actually discussed that as a senior leadership team, and one of the options with the reserve that we have is that we can accelerate that progress, because it's important to ask our suppliers what their carbon footprint is when they're supplying us and how they're going to mitigate and take actions to do any works or activity or supply services in an environmentally friendly way. And so by asking that in procurement, we then get those figures which are for the harder to calculate scope 3 emissions, which are where we apply other services.
Thank you. Councillor Corley.
I'm on now, thank you. Yeah, I thought I'd come back for a second bit of the chair, if you don't mind. Back to waste, which I think it's great what you're thinking there. I just want us to be clear, certainly for any of our residents who might be watching, we're not talking about reducing the size of our fleet until we've got to a point where we are actually reducing the waste that our residents are generating, are we? That is, I'm understanding that correct. I just want us to be clear in case anyone's just heard the last statement and think we're getting...
That's correct. So the first priority is encouraging our residents to create less waste.
Thank you. And I may share just another question on the waste topic. You talk about in your plan, I've lost it. Here we go. Support and celebrate reuse and recycling. I'm looking at your strategy on a page. I was in overview and scrutiny last night when we were seeing the place strategy, and we're looking at the environmental innovations pathways in the place strategy, and they talk about circular. And I've already mentioned this to Lara. Circular is not mentioned here. Is it something that you would consider? Certainly against the context of our partners in Cambridgeshire County Council, who all of a sudden decided no more sofas and didn't think to tell any of us until it was 5 minutes before we had to tell our residents. And thankfully we've found a way around that at this stage. But there are going to be more of those issues going forward. So are we going to commit more to circularity rather than just pure reuse?
I'm actually quite proud of our refuse department and how much circularity they already consider. We're quite lucky that given the Environment Agency's about turn on this issue, that we already had a bulky waste collection service so that our residents had an option and continue to have an option of what to do. But in topics like this, I think the more sustainable solution is via our relationship with the RECAP group. So for those of you who don't know, RECAP is a partnership where representatives from all the districts in Cambridgeshire meet and make decisions about waste. Because although Huntingdonshire is responsible for collecting waste, We're not responsible for disposing of the waste. Cambridgeshire County Council is. So when that recap group meets, they need to collectively make some progress on, as you say, circular reuse of waste. And I think some of the things that Neil has described about reusing the parts from our own vehicles, and it's definitely on the minds of our waste manager when he's thinking about waste.
Thank you. Councillor Alban.
Thank you, Chair. Going back to procurement, the ethical side of it, this panel years ago in its previous guise looked at the procurement policy of the District Council, and I believe then we looked at the ethics around procurement. How much of an ethical element is there in the procurement policy in terms of, there's question marks around the production of lithium batteries, that kind of thing. So I don't want us to be in a position where we're patting ourselves on the back for getting rid of single-use plastics, yet we're buying vehicles where there's question marks over the ethics of a battery that's gone into a vehicle. So that would be first of two questions. The other is not related. So take that first, please.
I suppose my answer to that would be that's quite a technical question on a specific matter that we'd probably be bringing forward in a decision making. The procurement policy would ask about carbon footprint and environmental implications, and we would then weigh them up through the alternatives that are available in the marketplace to satisfy the requirement that we have. And then that procurement decision will be based on what is the optimum based on that technology. So it's a good point, and it's getting more complicated, isn't it? And, you know, in those kinds of decisions, a bit like the fleet, you know, we have engaged the Carbon Trust in that because they're the experts, they do it all the time, whereas we do it once in a while. So it's important to recognise that we get the right advice at the right time. We wouldn't be specifying all of that in our procurement rules. We would just be asking what the environmental risks and considerations are. And then on something like that got quite technical, if there needed to be more work, then officers would do that work because it would be required. So I doubt we'd have an overarching policy for that because it would come out as a result of requesting what the environmental considerations are. And when we do a specification, if we can't specify that as officers because we're not experts, we would engage an expert to help us write that, to have consideration for what those environmental factors might be that we'd need to take account in that procurement. So there would need to be a frame of work around that, as opposed to the policy would say we'd have to consider it. And then for the specific item, we would look at specialist support and help, which would apply to any procurement exercise, whether it's IT or vehicles or anything.
I think perhaps another crux of your question is we have this challenge looming on the horizon, which is electric vehicles and all of the batteries that are needed to run them and when they will become redundant. And then how do we care for that waste? And similar to Councillor Cawley's question about circular waste, again, I think this is something that Cambridgeshire as a whole needs to be looking into the future into. How, if we're responsible for collecting the waste, but the county is responsible for disposing of the waste, then all of the districts in Cambridgeshire need to be thinking about that challenge that's coming on the horizon. And so this is one of the examples where it might not be in our direct sphere of influence, but in our direct ability to control, but we can influence it, and we should be influencing and asking that recap group to look farther forward on the horizon on how we're going to tackle that challenge as we approach it.
That wasn't exactly what I was asking, but that's part of my concern as well, is about going back to looking at how we dispose of existing resources, the carbon footprint by that. I mean, the ethical questions around the production of batteries going into electric vehicles. But I think, without overstepping your role as chair, Julie, I think it's something we could be involved in as a scrutiny panel. I know I think when you said, Lara, or Neil said that it's not straightforward, I know from looking at my own carbon footprint, I've sort of gone through the loop of living in Stilton. Do I walk down to the corner shop and buy goods and support a local business and not have a carbon footprint? Or do I drive 3 miles to Yaxley and buy organic vegetables that may have come from Peru? or do I go to Yaxley and buy village loose vegetables that might have been picked in Cambridgeshire, but I'm still driving 3 miles to get them? And I think there's every question produces another question. Speaking of which, the other unrelated question. Just going back to the graph you pointed out about carbon offset being the last resort. Why isn't it the first result as a quick win in the short term, while we look at the bigger picture and trying to tackle climate change as a whole and try and kick in our big things? Why can't we just offset some stuff initially to try and get some easy, quick wins?
I think I started off by talking about the strategy as our most important role is being an example to the rest of the people of Huntingdonshire. And I think that offsetting from the start would be quite a poor example to be showing to our residents of what to do in our current situation. And also, if we're going to use our funds wisely, I would rather be using them on trying to address the problem rather than put a sticking plaster on the problem at the moment, because our funds are limited. That's probably our biggest limitation in all of this work. And so we have to be very careful how we use it. And then when we use it, what example does that show to the community around us?
I would say it shows an example that we're willing to do things quickly and make an impact quickly and address a crisis at the same time as address.
Thank you. Maybe that's something we could discuss in our group. So, Councillor Lowe?
Yeah, thank you. An excellent report. What I would, going on with what Councillor Alban was saying about the quick wins, have much discussion or thought been for planning? You could ask development to, sorry, my brain's gone, do solar panels and thermal panels on new builds. You could have more greenery, green spaces and things. And I see that as a quick win, which will unfortunately tick very many boxes, but it will also just prove to residents as well that we are taking it seriously and we have made changes to our processes and the way things are done. Have you thought of any other sort of quick wins, if you like?
Yes, I think our ability to influence planning is probably one of the strongest levers that we have as a district council, because we are the planning authority. But I don't see it as a quick win. I see it as a medium-term win. But mostly that's because of the length of time it would take to implement the changes we'd like to make. So in the next months, you'll be seeing the review of the local plan underway. And you're right, that's where we should be using our influence to try to implement some of the ideas that you've mentioned. We also need to use our peers across the country to watch. We're not at the forefront of climate action. And there are some councils that are quite far ahead of us. And they have attempted things like additional planning documents that provide guidance to developers that might say, you should do this and you should do that. It can't say you must, because that would be a stronger assertion than what's in the National Planning Policy Framework. So as we watch those things develop, I think we need to find all of the good examples and see how much of that we might be able to learn from. But the local plan is the real tool that we will be able to use in tackling some of the issues that you've said. And we know that that topic is very important to our residents. That's clear in the surveys that we've done, that planning is where they would like to see us exerting our planning powers. So yes, I agree.
Thank you. Councillor Criswell.
Thank you, Laura. You rightly said near the beginning of your presentation, a lot of these actions on the action plan are quite distant into the future. In fact, they're all over a year away. And all of these actions have a cost. they have other implications, and they will have impacts, some good, some bad. And all of those taken into consideration will help focus on the prioritisation and maybe even find some quick wins. So you said obviously this would come back to us annually, but I think members would like to be far more involved much sooner than that in this prioritisation process, because obviously if that work is going on to see how much these actions are going to cost, what the implications will be, we don't want to find out in a year's time that that's what's happened and that's where we are. I think we would like an input, and certainly I would think Scrutiny would like to be part of that process, that as Neil and Helen work up, you've got two excellent councillors here, by the way, that many of us have been familiar with for a long time, so you've got some excellent support. But as that process develops to make these decisions, I think we would like to see that not wait for a year for the action to be delivered. We would like to be part of that process.
So I have an answer, but I know that Neil has an answer to that question as well. The method that we use to calculate our carbon is done annually. So in some ways, if we were to attempt to report more frequently than that, there wouldn't be a lot to tell you. On the other hand, we do have two very excellent officers, and I'm quite precious of their time, and I think their time is valuable, and I think we have to be very cautious on how much of their time is spent in reporting versus doing. But I think that the Climate Working Group is probably a vehicle by which there could be updates on specific things, and that might be the more frequent way of interacting with Scrutiny rather than providing a full report that's taken officer hours in order to create it. But I know that Neil probably has an idea on this one as well.
I suppose I can use a current example, which is we're looking at EV strategy. We've mentioned it before, the role of the district council in that, and working with the combined authority in terms of their approach to how that looks across the patch. So the proposition is that we would work with the Scrutiny Climate Working Group on that strategy and the development of that, so that members are involved in it. Where there is a proposal to do something different or invest money or make a decision, that would still go through the normal political process. So none of the decisions that are embedded within what the council does will be away from members. They will be embedded within the council's decision-making process. So please be reassured that any of those decisions, whether it's fleet or investment or what have you, that would go through the normal political processes and scrutiny that the council has as well, because officers will be presenting those. It won't be myself and Helen presenting the fleet investment plan. We'll be helping the responsible officer. It will be Andy and the fleet manager here saying, we would like to do this in this order and we think this is the best way to do it, and this is the evidence base that we've got to support that. They'll be the ones presenting that strategy to you, like George McDowell will be producing the EV strategy as well. So he'll be the one justifying those things. We'll be there making sure that he does it on time, that he's got the support he needs. If the reserve will help him to get to his destination quicker, that he's explored that option. That's part of our role in pushing those things forward. So I hope that helps.
Right. Yeah, thank you, Neil. Lara, you mentioned about the carbon assessment, but of course, so much in here isn't about carbon. It's not all just about climate, it's actually about the environment. So renewable energy, for example, resources are finite, so we'll be looking at renewable energy irrespective of the climate. Pollution, that's a health issue, we'd be looking at that irrespective of the climate. Biodiversity, helping to encourage nature, we'd want to be doing that irrespective of the climate. So this isn't all about a carbon assessment, this is about how we as a district serve our local environment, and some of the things on the action plan are very much focused on that. So as we work up how much these things cost and what the implications would be, I still think it would be valuable for us to have a handle on that rather than just wait for an annual general catch-all, if you like. I understand Neil's point about there being some specifics, but if they're gathered together in a package that we can look at, then so be it. I just don't want us to wait a year for that to happen. That's all. Thank you.
I think it would be reasonable for us to bring back to scrutiny more frequently feedback on specific actions in the climate action plan, and then annually come back in that larger package of assessment of the last year and the plan for the years going forward.
Thank you. So our next item on the agenda is about agenda planning. So if we could get something in the agenda, in the forward plan, to look at some of those, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
If I can just add, all the actions that are in the action plan will feature in service plans. They are part of the financial budget for the council that those services have got. It's the way in which they're spending their allocated budget for those services. Currently, there is no additional ask from those services to deliver those actions. As we progress and as we move forward from the current set of priorities which we've set before you, which is the top 3 items that we're concentrating on with officers to make the biggest impact on carbon footprint, we will work through the next set of options that are the next priority. So at the moment, our focus of our additional resources are on those things that will make the biggest difference, because if we put additional resources into all 60 items, we get into the realms of unfortunately not being able to progress the things that make the biggest difference. So I absolutely recognise the need for scrutiny, and we will be presenting the entire action plan back to you for review. But those actions will feature in the service plan of those services. They've been co-created with those services to appear in this strategy. Helen and I haven't sat and written those. We have helped the managers and the service managers to write those, so they're embedded in our thinking in what we'll do.
Thank you. Councillor Gardner.
Thank you very much, Chair. And thank you, Lara, for a very good report, and to the officers. My question is, going forward, when officers and other cabinet members present reports to Overview and Scrutiny or full council, can we expect to receive when in that report, how we're meeting the climate and environment goals? Because I think at all times we need to be able to see how we're meeting those goals. So, Lara, you're very good at presenting the climate and environmental goals for this administration. I would like to see that all your other fellow cabinet members are as well briefed as you have been tonight going forward.
Thank you. That's an excellent question. So if you look at the action plan, underneath the medium actions, I think it's the 5th action down, is every report that's created by officers has a section on environmental impact. And we need to design a more robust way of presenting that information to you that has more meaning to what's being used now. So one of the actions is what skills do we need to give the officers to be able to make that assessment and present it to you? So when you're being asked to make a decision, you have that added element of, well, what is the carbon impact of this decision? So one of the medium level actions is getting to the place where officers feel skilled in order to present that information to you in that way.
Thank you. Councillor Bywater.
First time, look at that. Thank you very much. Yes, very, very, very good report, and lots of really good comments by many of the members around the table. Positive example, I think that's really crucial. I think we've all got to give a positive example, and then that leads to being an enabler and encourager. And I know in Sawtree we've got a very active litter picking group, and that's a classic example of starting at the grassroots really, and that then links into the topic of less waste. We all want less waste. That's drives me nuts when you go into Tesco's or any other supermarkets are available. You know, the packaging drives me nuts when we've got vegetables in packaging. It just seems senseless. A couple of points I wanted to pick up on really is I'm going to be a grandfather in 5 weeks' time, and when we come to the end of this, my potential grandchild will be late teens by the time this strategy comes to the end. And I just want to touch on the importance of education. We've got a huge amount of education establishments within the district. I think it's really important to engage our young people on this process, because I don't think I'll be sat here in 2040, but you know, some of you may be, but I probably won't. I think education, encouraging our young people, because you know, they're tomorrow. These people are going to carry it for us, and I think we really must think about how we engage those. And then ultimately, we've talked about residents, parish councils, businesses. You know, there's fast food chains now that are discussing about putting registration numbers on drive-through so that, you know, it's easier traceable for our enforcement team, for example. So I think there's a lot of work that we could potentially do in relation to our businesses within the district. And, you know, how do we encourage them to, you know, buy into this, you know, potentially funding from them and, you know, being seen as a good business because they care about the environment. And, you know, that's got to be a selling point to lots of businesses and how we encourage those. So observations, really. I'm comfortable with the recommendations. Why wouldn't we be? So thank you very much.
First of all, I would say congratulations in advance. I hope you have enough energy for what's coming. I would use Sawtry actually as an example of a community that's really keen to get going on action as well. I think in the first week that I was here in May, receiving questions about we want to do more rewilding, we want to take action, and I think that we're developing ways that communities like that will be able to take that action. Your question around businesses, we do have business sustainability awards that our council gives out, but I think we could do more of publicizing and bringing more light onto those businesses that have been given the awards. We're looking at a few ways of how to do that, but you're right, businesses are very important in making these changes. Neil?
If I can add, the economic development team have worked up a series of pass-through grant funding for businesses. So businesses will be able to get advice on how they can become greener. And then if they're interested in taking those options on, then there's a follow-on grant to help them achieve that. It won't solve all businesses' problems, but it's a start and it's exemplar. So it's getting the ball rolling so that it gathers more momentum as we go through. So the economic development team are working on some of those solutions, and you'll see them in their service plan. And that's really an exemplar of how the climate strategy works. We've got a strategy that says that we should look at it. We're looking at things with a green lens on everything that what we do. And economic development have developed a scheme using funding and pass-through to support those businesses to do more. And absolutely, as Lara said, the existing award that we've got that's been, you know, we've tested it and piloted it, we can probably expand that more. And again, that might be an opportunity for the service to use the reserve to try out a different way to extend that more. But personal thing from me is we should be doing more stuff with businesses, full stop, the end. They're a massive customer of us, which we need to engage with more. So we definitely would like to engage with them more. Often they're hard to engage with. And again, a bit like Lara's appeal, if there's anything that you can do with your local businesses with the climate conversation to get them involved, we're very interested in pursuing that. And certainly with the schools, I mean, Helen might add that we had a massive influx of involvement with the schools to the later stage of the strategy, didn't we?
Yeah, actually, you'd be quite surprised at how well versed our young people are in the district in this. And actually, interestingly, one of the things I've learned through this process is our young people want to make the changes, but it's convincing their mums and dads and grandparents to make those changes for them. And often they don't have the resources or the financial backing to actually make those changes within their own lives sometimes. So actually, it's helping them teach us how to make those changes as well.
So have we got any more questions or comments? Councillor Gledo.
Finally, actually, I was just looking through the report, and I happened on the big ideas, and some of them are really quite interesting. Is there some you'd like to highlight, particularly that you think are runners, and we could actually go with that? I mean, I was particularly interested in the happiness scales as a psychologist, so I just thought it was great.
Futures, hunting the futures. That's where it's from. Yeah. It's the place strategy.
So I think the appendix that you're referring to is part of the place strategy. And so there are definitely links between the climate strategy and the place strategy. But yes, I would have to defer to the leader of the council to respond on the place strategy.
Councillor Hunt?
There we go, got it working. No, one of my colleagues very correctly mentioned young people. It's like a bat signal for me to jump in now. But it is extremely important to keep young people engaged. And I'm very glad about the engagement that's been done with younger people in the report so far. Continuing onwards, what kind of are we planning to do kind of to keep young people engaged? And what can we do to kind of empower their voices? Because as a young person, a lot of, like you've said, is to do with changing other people's behaviors. What can we do to kind of empower young people to kind of shout about what needs to be changed so it does get changed going forward? Like, as part of the climate conversation, is there a way that we can give them like a dedicated voice in that conversation or something like that?
So I think one of the things that we've really learned through this process was our engagement with Anglia and Ruskin University and the students, because we had grand ideas and grand strategies of things. And we had really exciting examples of car sharing in Nigeria and practical things which are much more practical that people can do, you know, even changing light bulbs still, where, you know, we're talking about LED lighting arrays, and actually residents' concerns are very different to our strategic thoughts about this. So those are being factored into that, the pilot stuff that we'll do with communities. I think the other aspect as well is that we're looking at the newly reinvigorated youth councils that are coming online. And actually what we want to do is connect them up. So we've already started having those conversations. So subject to approval of the strategy and the climate conversation approach, then part of the climate coordinator's role is to start connecting up some of those opportunities to get inputs from those youth councils, because those opportunities have reopened back up to us, which is a fantastic opportunity.
Can I just thank you for that? Because it is really important, because having previously been in the kind of teenager age group, that the problem a lot of people in that age group face is kind of being old enough to have a very strong opinion on an issue, but being too young to vote and kind of have a say on which of us get to sit here. Because I know we all feel very strongly on this issue, and we've all been very big advocates for it, but some people aren't lucky enough to have the kind of the representatives that share their views, and feeling kind of making sure they feel empowered to kind of speak and feeling like they have those mechanisms to go forward. So I really do thank you for that.
Thank you, Councillor Olben.
Thank you, Chair. It's interesting listening to some of the things come through. I remember a few years ago we had the company in Huntingdon. Is it Enviropack? They're one of the leaders in environmental packaging, and they came and gave a presentation. And I think they are an exemplar that, if we're looking for a business to work with, they're very good about. I think they're the forefront of using grey trays for meat rather than black. And that making such a difference. The other thing I'm reminded of was sitting here listening to the traffic in years gone by when that was the A14. That was one of the most polluted parts of Huntingdonshire, and the tree planting that a lot of it hasn't taken on the A14. So as a plea, as cabinet member for environmental, if you, Lara, can take that up with the Transport Agency, Huntingdonshire residents through council tax put money into the A14, and one of the things, the kickbacks, was we were getting lots of trees to absorb some of the carbon, not just here but the other districts in Huntingdonshire. So I'd urge that to be done, please. And finally, I would just picking up on some of the points that Councillor Criswell made and you yourself made about about how we're judged and a timescale, I think it'd be really good for on both our side as a scrutiny panel and for the executive side to have some yardsticks established. So we're given some ideas of how we might, as a scrutiny panel, judge the progress and timelines. So if I could add an item D to the recommendations, that a draft process be presented to overview and scrutiny that we can use as a yardstick to judge the progress of the climate change strategy. I think that would be a good thing to do. If we look, not that we're presented with something now, but that with something we can look at and report back and say, yeah, this is a realistic timescale we can look at and work with, rather than just say, yeah, we'll look at something over the year and these things might not come up. I'd like some more structure to it.
Yes, I'll certainly take away that comment about the A14 in the planning and explore how we might be able to use our influence there. In terms of measuring progress, I think some of those yardsticks are there for you to measure how well this is happening. One is on the trajectory, are we below the red line? So that's the first yardstick. The second yardstick is on the action plan, the date by which the action should be completed. And have we achieved that? Are we on track to achieve that? I think those are two milestones that are built in.
I think they're two good milestones to start with as something that could be presented to ONS, and there might be others that the executive might want to present to us and we might want to look at and try and agree a strategy to build on what's presented and formalise what's presented and what's in there and encapsulate it into an agreed set of targets.
Thank you. We'll follow that up. Has anyone got any more comments or questions? Councillor Gardiner.
Just a very quick question. With regard, in the parish that I actually live in, and I'm the chairman of the parish council, we are looking at EV charging points in the village to look at, so that where people can't have charging points at their own properties, that we could provide them with that at the village hall car park. But it's hard for parish councils in certain instances to find funding going forward to achieve those sorts of goals, whether it be EV charging or whatever. And it would be useful if the district council could provide a roadmap to parishes of how they could try and get funding for environmental and climate change works that they could do, moving forward. We've already got solar panels and things like that to help reduce the electricity bills in the village hall and that sort of thing. So that's another thing where we could work forward with you if we had a bit more of a signpost going forward as to where we could go and get that funding, because I know we won't be able to get funding for some of those things from the district council or the county council for that matter.
We're very happy to work with any parish councils to share any knowledge that we've got and expertise. Obviously, as you're aware, we've invested in newer EV charging in our off-street car parks. Particularly for EV, we're producing an EV strategy in conjunction with the combined authority to know who does what where, so it all matches up and makes sense. But we can contact you afterwards, because one of the things we are looking at is how we can draw funding down as a district that actually can be spent in the parish for exactly what you're mentioning. So there is actually a route, but we want to try and package it so that we're asking for many, not one. So which isn't a criticism at all. It's just saying it'd be useful to have some pilot sites to drum up the enthusiasm. Absolutely. In terms of other grant funding opportunities, Biodiversity for All, there'll be pass-through grant funding for that, which we're developing the scheme to then roll that out. So that approach is what we will take. Unfortunately, the nature of this funding at the moment is that it's quite sporadic. It's a bit like fireworks going off. And so what we're trying to do is make sure that we've got the opportunity to use other agencies, whether it's community groups, community interest companies, parish councils, as the delivery agents for that. It's not necessarily the right place for the district council to deliver all of those things. So very much we are looking at how we pass that through. So as an ethos, that's what we're doing. And as we get those opportunities, I think your suggestion of having a list of what they are as they arise is a really good one, and actually keeping a rolling list of what those opportunities are that people can look up against would be a good idea as well, and we can include that as part of the climate conversation topic as well. So thank you for that suggestion.
I would reflect on your question by offering a challenge that you could take back to your parish, and that goes back to this chart of ways of thinking about what change we need to make. Do you need to provide more electric vehicle charging, or do we need to have fewer people driving cars? And another solution may be the parish investing in one electric vehicle on a charging station that various members of the community can use as and when they need it. So to be thinking about reducing the use and the need for the technology in the same solution, to think about it holistically.
Thank you. Are there any further questions or comments? No. So I'd just like to thank you, Laura, Helen and Neil, for your amazing answers and fantastic presentation to us. And again, I'd just like to thank you for the report. It was so easy to read. It was so, I would say, enjoyable to read because the diagrams made everything so obvious and clear. So I really appreciate it. And I think everyone agrees here in the room. It was just an excellent report. I don't think anyone's got any issues with it. So on that, we're looking to endorse the recommendations in the report to the Cabinet. At this point, I'm only going to ask the people from our scrutiny group to have a show of hands. So can I just check that everyone is in agreement of encouraging the Cabinet to endorse the recommendations within this report? Can I have a show of hands on that? Anyone got issue? Yes, we'll bring that in, thank you. So in that case, can we make that noted? So thank you again for your representations. Thank you. So we can now move on to agenda item 5, overview and scrutiny working programme. Are we happy to receive the overview and scrutiny working programme? Good. Now, Part B, we're going to discuss future items for the programme. We've come up with quite a few tonight. Have we got those noted?
Yes.
Yes. Has anyone got any other issues that they'd like to raise or have in the programme? Councillor Criswell.
Yes, thank you. I have raised the issue before around health issues. I'm very aware the County Council is a statutory scrutiny for health, but we, I and other councillors I know are fielding issues about GP surgeries. We have Hinchinbrook in our district, which is of great interest to us. Traditionally, not recently, we have had the GCP in front of us and people from Hinchinbrook Hospital. I don't know what's working well at Hinchinbrook and what isn't, and perhaps we should do. Health Watch is a very good starting point for some of the complaints they may be receiving about health activities. I think, I would like to see us do a piece of work around health, separately perhaps with the GCP and with Hinchinbrook. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Criswell. One of the things we've been working on quite a lot recently is, members might recall, we had a session recently about warm spaces and what that meant, and recognising that some of the issues that led to people needing to go to a warm space were kind of economic or housing-based or social rather than, at root. Actually, as part of that, we've been training social prescribers within a number of the GP settings. We trained 12 yesterday. We've got another 9 tomorrow looking at trying to make sure that income, employment, housing, social connection and physical activity are built in throughout that. So we can absolutely look at health at the widest level and the economic crisis and a range of other factors have contributed this year. But if it'd be useful, bringing back the sort of the outputs and outcomes in terms of some of the work we talked about previously would be something that would be well placed to bring back, early in the cycle.
As I said, we could include the CCG with that and some reports from Hinchinbrook and Health Watching.
Thank you. Has anyone else got anything they'd like to add to the programme? No, in that case, that's our last item. So I just want to make the comment, isn't it exciting that this climate strategy has actually united the council? I just think that's actually really amazing and it's such an important issue. So I just thank you all for your attendance.